Good evening, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the 2022 Honors Program Global Challenges discussion. What an amazing time for discussion of politics, place, and care. I'd like to recognize some of the folks that are in the room. I'm Ed Taylor, I'm Dean of Undergraduate Academic Affairs, and part of my work is to work closely with the UW Honors Program, its students, faculty, and staff that I've come to care about very much. This community has truly become a community that has expanded the circle of care, students and faculty, staff, volunteers, members of the broader community. This would be a point at which I'm supposed to acknowledge in my notes. It says acknowledge regents and dignitaries and others. Honors Advisory Board members, would you please stand for a second and wave for the Honors Advisory Board members? Thank you. Let's give a hand for... And absent regents, I don't think there are Board of Regent members here, so I'm going to replace them with an all the more important guest. And Stephanie Smallwood will introduce Brandon Wu, our moderator, but maybe instead of introducing regents, I can introduce Brandon's parents. Lily and Peter Wu, would you please stand up? Because to my knowledge, this is the first time that we've had a student moderator for this event. We are people from throughout the community who represent varied areas of knowledge, geographies, identities, who share a passion for addressing complex issues that may never be really fully addressed or fully solved. But we can at least address them, and we can address them collaboratively and with courage. All of our students and those who represent University of Washington Honors uphold the values of the UW's public mission. And it is a public mission. And this event is a demonstration of that commitment in action. Students are thinking broadly and deeply about timely and important and enduring issues. They connect the disciplinary dots with the aim of creating positive public outcomes, and again, expanding the circle of concern to include all of the living. Leadership matters, and I won't say much about my college athletics days, but one of the things I learned in college was to get the ball to your talent and then get out of the way. I had a chance to invite Stephanie Smallwood last year to lead the honors program, and a highlight of my year was that she said yes. Stephanie Smallwood is an associate professor in the Department of History and Comparative History of Ideas, and the Dio Richardson Endowed Professor in History, where she is also a faculty associate of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. Her research and teaching explore early modern histories of slavery, colonialism, and race, with particular emphasis on the transatlantic slave trade, racial capitalism, and African diasporas in America. She is a remarkable teacher, and a remarkable leader, and a remarkable scholar. And so I give you Stephanie Smallwood.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you everyone for coming out on a cold, blustery evening where we're all a little disoriented from turning our clocks back yesterday. We are so delighted to have you with us here in person, and those of you who are tuning in on our live stream. We arrived at our theme for this evening's discussion, the power and politics of place and care, by surveying freshman interdisciplinary honors students last spring and asking them, what are the global challenges that keep you up at night? And we received a long list of responses, and we identified displacement, or what we might think of as the politics of place, as a through line that connects several, at first seemingly disparate concerns that students had named, such as houselessness in Seattle, imperialism, and our obligation to immigrants and refugees pulled away from their homes by wars and climate crises, among other causes. I expect we will touch on all of these topics in this evening's discussion. However, we cannot engage responsibly with a theme that centers the politics of place without first acknowledging that by our presence here, those of us who are not Alaskan Native or Native American are complicit in the past and ongoing displacement of the indigenous peoples of this continent that many of its native polities call Turtle Island. So let us begin by recognizing that as members of the University of Washington community, we are on Native lands, that it is the Coast Salish peoples who belong to these lands washed by the waters of the Salish Sea, and that we who are the beneficiaries of the ongoing settler colonization of these lands have an obligation to not merely acknowledge indigenous presence, but to enact such recognition with sober and thoughtful intentionality. The intention to ask questions that make us uncomfortable and commit to building relationships with the peoples native to the lands where we live and work that nurture their well-being and support the redress of past and ongoing harms to their communities in which we are, again, complicit. It's my honor, picking up where Ed left off, to acknowledge also how excited we are to have a student for the first time as the moderator of this event. And this is an idea that came to us as we were talking about how much our goal with this event is to model for our audience, for our community, how much we on Honors really value Honors being a community where faculty and students and staff and all members of our community come together with a passion for inquiry and a passion to learn together. So it seemed natural that one of the things that was missing as of yet in this ongoing evolution of the Global Challenges project was to bring a student, one of our honors students, fully into the conversation that we have this evening. So I'm really excited to pass things over now to our moderator, Brandon Wu, who is an interdisciplinary honors student majoring in neuroscience and public health. So without any further ado, let's get the conversation that we're going to have this evening started. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Ed, for that introduction. It is so incredible to see everyone here. And once again, welcome everyone to Global Challenges. I'm really excited to go ahead and get this started. So I'm going to start out. I'm just going to say a little bit about myself, who I am, and then we're going to talk about what you can expect from this event, and we're going to introduce our speakers. So first off, I'll talk about myself. So again, my name is Brandon. I go by he, him pronouns, and I'm really, really excited to be here. I grew up in Issaquah, so just 30 minutes east of here, not that far off. And I have just had an incredible time with the honors program thus far. I'm very, very passionate about mental health, which is one of the main reasons why I decided to major in public health and neuroscience and get at that intersection. And the honors program played a very large role in my thoughts in combining those two subjects. And so speaking of the honors program, this is my third year in it. I was a freshman admit in the year of 2020, like many others during the year of COVID. Not so great. But I think we've learned a lot from it. I'm also an honors peer educator, so this is my second year educating classes for the Honors 100 class. I see some familiar faces here, which is very exciting. But Honors 100 has just been one of the greatest experiences. The students in it, the depth of the conversations that we have, and just the stories that each student has been nothing short of incredible. I'm hoping that as the moderator, by the end of this conversation, all of you will have kind of an idea of what we're talking about and be able to feel it as something that's applicable to both your life and your studies, and also have it be something that you feel is actionable. But yeah, so that's a little bit about myself. I'm now going to talk a little bit about what you can expect from this event. So you all filled out an RSVP form, as you probably already know, when you came into this event. And one of the questions we asked was, what are one of the themes or like things that you want us to talk about? And from that, we narrowed it down. We talked and got 3 concise, hopefully general and encompassing questions to answer those. So yeah, we have those 3 questions now that we'll discuss. After that, around 7 p.m., we're going to transition to a Q&A. That's going to be led by our fellow honors student, Shannon Hong. I am so sorry, I am completely blanking on something. Oh, there are 2 ways that you can ask questions for the Q&A. The first one is if you're watching us online on the live stream, you can go to bit.ly/gc-questions. Again, that's bit.ly/gc-questions if you would like to submit a question. It should also be in the description of the video. For those of you who are in person, you should be given an index card or a piece of paper and something to write with. Feel free to write down any question that comes to mind throughout this event. Just write that down and we'll get to them around 7 o'clock. And yeah, I'm really excited for it. So this event from start to end is what you all as students are passionate about, what keeps you up at night, what you're concerned about, and what you're interested about. So I think now it's time to get into the speakers. So from Harborview Medical Center, we have Martine Pierre-Louis. We also have from the College of Arts and Sciences, LaShonda Pittman, Megan Yubara, and our Honors Program Director, Stephanie Smallwood. So would each of you like to take just 2 minutes and talk about who you are, any introduction you would like, how your work connects to what we call the politics of place and care, and also just to relate with the students, where were you in college? Like when you were 18 or 19, what were you doing and what were you thinking about? How about we'll have Martine go first.
Okay, 2 minutes. We'll try. So as Brendan said, my name is Martine Pierre-Louis, and one of the things that I like to do is also invite my identities into the room. And I think that as I do so, and as I name those identities, it also gives space for those identities that are not traditionally acknowledged in this sort of a space. So I also like to say that I identify as Haitian, African American, I identify as lesbian, I identify as an elder, and my pronouns are she and her. So at the age of 19 or so, I had been in this country for about, I'd say about 5 years or so. And I was in college. I was not speaking very much. I was actually training to be an engineer because my Haitian parents believed that there were a very limited number of professions that were acceptable for someone like me that was considered smart. So I could go into medicine, I could go into law, or I could go into engineering. And I didn't want medicine, I didn't want law, and I could do numbers, so I thought engineering was it. They were very unhappy when I changed to sociology. But they hung in with me. And so I was really pleased about that. But college, my 4 years of college, were an exciting year of exploration for me. And I hope that it is for you as well. And I'm really glad to be here.
this working? Okay, great. Whew. Hi, everybody. I'm LaShonda Pittman. I am a sociologist by training, associate professor in American Ethnic Studies, the new Jaff Hanauer Honors Professor in Western Civilization. And I would say that, thanks. It's kind of dope to be up here with Stephanie and this, new iteration of the program. It's pretty amazing. I've loved this program since the moment I was exposed to it. I think that connects to a little bit of me in college. When I met with the honor students here, I was like, oh my God, all these big hearts and big heads. I just saw so much of myself. And the other thing that I saw with honor students that really drew me and that reminded me of my own college years was the deep commitment to community work, to activism, to volunteerism. And so I would say in addition to working nearly full-time, being in school full-time, volunteering, activism was a big part of it for me. I was actually just called back to my undergraduate institution to celebrate the protest that led to the development of Africana Studies. So it's kind of weird, like how it all kind of comes full circle. Starting to feel old. How my work relates to the topic, I have a forthcoming book called Grandmothering While Black, a 21st century story of love, coercion, and survival that's based on the experiences of about 75 grandmothers on the Chicago South Side raising their grandchildren. And so place and care are pretty central to what I do as a scholar, and I'm really excited about the conversation tonight.
I'm also really excited and honored to be here in this conversation and with all of you. My name is Megan Ibarra. My pronouns are she and her. My access needs are met. I'm an associate professor of geography, so we love the placemaking. So my father was a Mexican Catholic, and it was only towards the end of his life that I learned that he was called a traquero. So he grew up in the Inland Empire, and what that meant was that he grew up on the railroad. He lived in a boxcar until the age of 16. He didn't have a house. And so the notion of being able to put down roots and to have place was sort of a lifelong dream of his, and what he really wanted, well, what he really wanted was a son, but what he got was 3 daughters. And he's Mexican Catholic, what can I say? So he got 3 daughters, and he was like, okay, if this is what we have, you're all gonna stay here with me within a 60-minute drive. I would like a doctor, a lawyer, and a professor. So to his great frustration, I immediately decided to go across the country to New York for college. So that's where I was when I was 19, in New York City, also as far away from my parents as I could be. I don't remember how many majors I tried on and put away, but let's just say there were more than 3. And at the end of the day, the joke is on me because he got the professor after all, but we never would have guessed. I left high school having been suspended for insubordination repeatedly, and due to multiple disabilities, the district tried to kick me out, and we fought and we won. And I don't think anybody ever thought that I would have ended up a college professor, certainly not me, my first year of college. So displacement has ended up taking up a big theme in the work that I've done. My first book published is called Green Wars. It's published in both English and Spanish. And I look at the ways in which Maya-Chi indigenous land defense in Guatemala is shaped by and shapes the politics of international conservation, with a real focus on white conservationists out of Washington, D.C., who often have little cultural and linguistic capability in Spanish, much less Mayan languages. And my second book that I'm working on centers on thinking about how we move from what Mariam Kaba calls death-making institutions towards life-affirming institutions through the practices of radical placemaking, focusing specifically on the Tacoma tar pits, which is a Superfund site. It is Puyallup land, and it also houses the Northwest Detention Center, which is the only immigrant detention center in Washington and Oregon states right now.
All right. I think I'm going to start with the wonderful innovation that Brandon brought to this conversation by asking us about who and where we were in our lives as college students. I went to college in New York in the 1980s, and I'd say each year was a different life. I tried on a different version of myself each of my 4 years. The first year, it was New York City, it was the birth of hip hop. The honest truth is I was going to clubs with my classmates who were fellow New Yorkers. My sophomore year, I discovered a political identity for the first time. And it was the first time, I mean, obviously I'd known my whole life that I was this thing called Black. But this was the first time that I had an opportunity to disrupt what had been a kind of taken for grantedness growing up in Midwestern suburbs in the 1970s. I didn't have the opportunity, even at prep schools, to actually study where this racial order came from. And I believe that's why I ultimately got really interested in being a historian. But it started with activism. It started with, as a sophomore, getting pulled into an anti-apartheid demonstration against investments in companies doing business with the apartheid racist regime of South Africa at the time. And that led to actually reading about African history. And up till then, I was also trying on majors. I didn't have an intellectual direction. I was lost. And I found an anchor, and I found an intellectual purpose through that activism that led to studying African history, realizing that I could put together a major that involved studying African history, which even that at the time had to be done as a kind of special independent major. There weren't programs for undergraduate students in African or African American studies at the time. And then that led to me just moving further back in time, because I think I slowly, thinking about how my life and my work connects to the themes for the evening, my work ultimately has come, as Ed said when he introduced me, to center on the transatlantic slave trade, a massive structure of forced displacement. But I think what led me to want to study history was realizing kind of intuitively or subconsciously that this history is what explained the fracturing of my own family. Why is it that my grandparents were from the South, but my parents were born in the Midwest? Why is it that my nuclear family, were in the suburbs, and some of my cousins were still in the city, and that was a really big deal? Why is it that, I still haven't forgiven my dad for moving us from Columbus, Ohio, where I was born, where my parents were both born, and knew each other growing up as children. I've never forgiven my dad to this day, we laugh about it, for moving our nuclear family from Ohio to St. Louis in the 1970s, which he did because what an extraordinary thing it was for my dad to actually get tapped for a kind of middle upper management track, right, in corporate America that came with moving your family and not thinking twice about it. So I think for me, wanting to understand this racial order that structured my life as a middle-class suburban kid is why once I finally got to college and once I finally was able to really understand that there was a history that something had produced this thing. And I got interested in slavery, then I got interested in early slavery, and then I got interested in the slave trade, which is where my research is centered now.
Wonderful. Well, I'd just like to take a moment to say what an incredible moment to have such incredible people doing incredible work with us here tonight. And I can't say how excited I am to hear all of your thoughts on the prompts that we have today. The first one, I think we've slightly already touched on it, but we just want to look a little bit deeper about what causes displacement. So we know that displacement is something that's produced by a wide variety of factors. So this can range from colonialism to war to climate change, all very important things that we should be focused on. I'm just wondering for you all, what are the most prominent causal factors that you encounter in your work? And given the complexity between these causal factors, how have unexpected views, paths, or knowledge influenced how you understand what underlies displacement? That's a very loaded question, but anyone can feel free to say the first.
I'll get us started. So for those of you who've had a chance to read where I work at Harborview Medical Center. And in my current position, I am Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I have spent a couple of decades working in communication assistance, also within Harborview, and creating programs for immigrants and refugees. In my current work within the medical center and working especially on issues of equity, what I see is that we really do see displaced persons. And there are multiple reasons for displacement, all right? I mean, we see populations of folks who are houseless, and that's one of the reasons. We see folks that are internally displaced within the United States, people who are displaced because of, tornadoes or hurricanes that now come with such a force that the complete and total destruction that happens is something that they cannot recover from in the way that they could in the past. And there's not really that real recognition that this is now different in 2020 or 2022 than it was back 20 years ago. Or forest fires, right? Regions that are getting devastated by forest fires that used to be safe. In addition to the populations of refugees and immigrants proper that we define as displaced persons. But all of these groups are defined socially and politically in very different and separate ways. And and the political definitions of these various groups don't really intersect. And when we see those groups within the healthcare system, now, keep in mind that within the healthcare system, those of us that work on the inside, we really do know that part of the view that we take is that everything that we encounter has to have a label that connects to a way to charge the insurance system, right? And so I hate to have this perspective, but this is part of the reality, right? And so everything has to be structured within that way. But we really do know that our healthcare system hasn't even begun to deal with issues of multi-generational issues of bias and structural bias and all of these various issues that are built into the structures of our system. I certainly encountered that as a director of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so how do we even begin to create the language to deal with all of these various kinds of displacements and how individuals present and how they speak about their experiences of displacement within our context. I find that I work with teams to try to understand, well, how is that particular displacement affecting that community or this community? And how does it look like? And how might it resemble this other one? And, within our group, we don't even try to think about how do we charge for it down the line. That's not even my concern. But how do we even begin to grasp it and start to work with it? We don't have the language for it yet. We truly do not have the language for it. I think part of the connection and part of what needs to happen and part of what hopefully will continue to be developed is that this language will start to emerge because there are connections. I certainly do see those connections.
When you started talking about the need to label, I started giggling because I feel like one of my superpowers as a middle-class, multiply disabled person is whenever I get new care, I have learned to just find and copy and paste my diagnosis code from my previous care provider. And it just opens up doors, my friends. And I think about all these different ways in which you have to, when you think about having, so I have 2 neurologists and they don't talk to each other, and even though I have the same brain, they don't want to know about the different parts of it. And so, thinking about how do you as a whole person make yourself legible in order to receive care is literally a lifelong and life-sustaining project for me, because one of my diagnoses I didn't get until I had my first job as a tenure-track professor, and I had healthcare insurance that didn't have a lifetime limit. And so I think about that very deeply. And when you were sort of talking about how it's not our primary concern, but we need to have these labels, on my end, I see that, so my role technically is as a country conditions expert, and I was thinking about the ways in which our legal administrative system needs to see people as refugees, as asylees, or simply as undocumented immigrants, and the work that labeling does to make them legible to a system that decides what and to what extent and in what context people might be eligible for the support that they need. And one of the things that, so I have testified as a country conditions expert in, I don't know how many, but definitely more than 20 cases in San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and New York. As you can tell, the places that have supports for people to get asylum are generally pretty bi-coastal. The one exception to that has been when people I know from fieldwork in rural Guatemala have found their way to the border, and I'll get a phone call or I'll get a message on WhatsApp that's like, hey, this person has been disappeared, and they're actually using the language of the Guatemalan Civil War, like this person has been disappeared, we think that the state stole him, can you help us find him? And in those cases, one guy I remember finding him out in rural Texas, And he was like, I just told him I can't go back. It's not safe for me to go back. And I was like, okay, Arturo, let me teach you a new word. It's called asylum. I need you to go to the guard and I need you to tell him this. And that didn't work. And then I mailed in like a 200-page packet that was like how to apply for asylum. And I mailed it in English, even though the person I was talking to didn't actually speak Spanish very well. But I was like, now they can't ignore that this is a political category that I, as a professor, and I included my business card, am assigning to him. And I had to call the Office of Refugee Resettlement and demand that he be allowed to speak to his child at least once a week, and had to use kind of all of this legal language in order to make his plight legible to this administrative state. It makes me think a lot about Dean Spade's work on administrative violence and about how the need to categorize people is how we administer a kind of violence that we see as providing services sometimes. And the thing I'll say that I've learned the most out of that is that over and over again, I, as someone who has learned about these laws, I, as someone who got a PhD, I had a particular set of expectations about migration and displacement. I imagined it as sort of a singular process. You go, you're displaced, you end up somewhere, you seek asylum, and then you stay there. And when I interviewed people about their relationship to indigenous land defense and their experiences with displacement in the context of Guatemala's 36-year civil war and then conservation, and I would ask them to tell me their stories, invariably they would reach back and tell me about how their grandfather was displaced from his land by the German when they made that coffee plantation. Mm-hmm. And then their father was displaced in a different moment. And then they were displaced by the Civil War and then by the conservationists. And over again, they have these multiple punctuated moments, and in the same way that you're talking about multi-generational trauma, they're actually able to narrate the ways in which this experience of being indigenous and displaced shapes their relationship to place and their the ways in which their deep ties to homeland are in spite of this massive state and state-sanctioned violence. And one of the things that just always surprises me, even now, is I've worked with folks for years where they'll end up winning asylum in a place like San Francisco, and they still actually dream about going back home. The number one reason why people want to get their citizenship is so that they can try to imagine a world in which they get to take their kids home to see the land that they farmed on, that they hope and they imagine that one day when things are different, that they might have the political, social, and economic possibility to do so again. And so that deep looking back and that incredible optimism is, I think, the main unexpected thing I have learned from working with people who I try to make legible to the state as asylum seekers.
I love this. I really appreciate the sort of through line around legibility and displacement and access to services that are critical to not being displaced, right? And that it's an issue that refugees and immigrants experience, but also all others that fall outside of certain definitions of any number of things, right? And so I look at the families that I study, and there are more grandparents raising grandchildren than at any other time in American history, and you would think, given how prevalent it is, it would be much more, it'd be easier to get access to services. And so what I end up finding is that, first of all, the state has co-opted what was historically an informal system of care among communities of color, especially, and European immigrants before the big umbrella of whiteness. So now that's something that the state uses as literally the primary service to children who need out-of-home care that are taken into state custody. So it's like, we're gonna take children away from families instead of giving them the resources they need to stay where they are, and then create this big umbrella of legal statuses that grandparents and other relatives now have to navigate. And then outside of that system, you've got families that either fall into sort of the low income, trying to get services through that means, but don't have the sort of legal rights to qualify as families to get it, or they get elder services, but they're still raising children, and nobody expects that for a 70 or 80-year-old, so they fall outside of that system. So the displacement piece is so big in that way. When I look at the families I look at are grandmother-headed households, and 67% of them live in poverty for issues that are very much sort of related to these ideas of displacement. So either caring for children whose parents are incarcerated, which is a form of displacement, mass incarceration, or, you know, dealing with, you know, the child welfare system being overly concentrated in poor communities of color and communities of color. And so it's this real historical, cyclical dynamic, right? So you look back into a lot of these families and they were in some ways impacted by similar events, but that looked different in their time period, right? And so it might not be mass incarceration, but 50 years ago or 60 years ago, it was like chain gangs and convict leasing, or it was sharecropping, whereas now it's like that the majority of jobs available to low-wage folks are, you know, they don't come with benefits, so on and so forth. So it's, you know, it's really like, for me, putting together these two really critically vulnerable groups, children and elders, inside of systems of displacement and impoverishment, and making it all legible is what I hope my book will do, frankly. It's the first one that will actually center these various, what I call quasi-legal rights, you know, that these grandparents have relative to their grandchildren. And even they have a hard time understanding what the rights are. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
And I come into the conversation as the one who studies the seemingly distant past, right? And I'm sitting here thinking about, you know, how does my engagement with the lives and experiences of enslaved people in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries connect to what you all have reflected on. And, you know, the thing is, when I think about the question that was posed, you know, what are the kind of causal factors that come into the domain of displacement that I study, what comes to mind immediately is colonialism and capitalism. And, you know, I increasingly what I enjoy about being in conversations like this is how much we don't do enough to kind of really give ourselves a perspective to see the through lines, and that, you know, maybe it's time for us to ask big and bold questions and not assume that the things that we typically kind of celebrate as part of modernity and part of a kind of line of progression from past to present, it come at a cost. Because you know, when I think about a course that I designed when I first came to the University of Washington in 2008, and the title of the course was Slavery and Slave Trading in the 21st Century. And that is a course title that would have been nonsensical when I was in grad school in the 1980s, training as a specialist in early African American history and the history of the slave trade, because we had convinced ourselves that these structures and these things were safely part of the past, right? And it was, and of course they never actually went away. Slavery never actually went away. Human trafficking never actually went away. And there are ways that these things that seem impossible to understand, like where does this come from, I feel like history is the thing that gives us the perspective that we need to ask really different, tough questions. You know, to ask ourselves, well, maybe the things that we call modern progress, again, have come at a cost. Modern progress for who? What are the ways that capitalism relies on, has always relied on a kind of racial differentiation, that some humans deserve rights and some humans are always going to fall out of a system of classification that governs who gets to be treated as a full person and who doesn't.
I think these are some fascinating things that you all bring up, and so many just powerful statements that were made, whether it's from healthcare, indigenous populations, from elderly care, colonialism, and society as a whole with capitalism. There's so many things. And I wish we could spend more time on this question, but we're going to have to move on a little bit. Then we've talked a little bit now about the why and how of displacement and how it's in deeply rooted problems that don't necessarily have simple solutions. Let's turn our attention a little bit towards trying to address these problems that we've outlined. So what have you all learned from displaced communities and people that guides your understanding of the way forward to a more just and equitable world?
We promised that we wouldn't stay with the depressing for too long. We would try not to, which for us is actually kind of a challenge, and it's a lift. I've been thinking about this sort of question and how to move with it, and I'm a little bit nervous about doing it now that I'm sitting next to a historian as I think about this, but we'll do it anyway. Okay, so I was thinking about this as a geographer, and sort of one of the moments that you find in historical geography readings that's just been really inspiring and important to me as I learned and read and taught with my students in a class called Race, Nature, and Power, is the stories that now we can verify using fancy DNA techniques, but that the people themselves always knew were true, that women from an area that we would call Senegambia or the Rice Coast would braid rice in their hair and bring it over through the slave trade and plant rice in place like the Carolinas, that it was really black women who were enslaved who were making new futures for themselves in the Americas. And I say the Americas because Brazil is also another place where extensive DNA testing has been done to demonstrate this fact that black families have known amongst themselves for generations. They have carried these stories, and they've carried the ways in which women as mothers made places and homes through survival in situations that are sort of unimaginable, with futures that they did not know what they were facing. And I've been inspired recently to kind of come back to that by one of my advisees, who is a doctoral student in the geography program. Wesley Carrasco is indigenous Lenca, which in terms of the settler nation-state system would be Honduras. And part of his research is looking at the ways in which displaced indigenous peoples in LA engage in placemaking. And a lot of what he ended up talking about was the ingenious and hilarious methods that people use to get maize or corn seeds from their home areas, from their rural villages at home, so that they can plant a little seed of maize and have their corn in urban LA. And they're engaging in this kind of radical placemaking that's reshaping what we understand as community gardening. What does a garden look like? What is the purpose of a garden? And what are the quote unquote heirloom seeds that we value? It's a completely different understanding than one that I had previously had. And I think what it always reminds me is that when I go to the dark structural, racial capitalist, settler colonialism, genocidal place, that I have to remember that the survivors themselves are engaging in some of the most creative acts that I can never expect unless I sit and I learn with them about it. So hopefully that was okay in terms of the history.
Yes, absolutely, because I mean, I can segue beautifully from those examples, Megan, because I think the struggle is that what we learn from displaced people, whether we're talking about enslaved people in the 17th century or displaced people today, is that we as humans have this inherent need and capacity to create connection and community in the face of the most violent, inhumane systems and structures of oppression. It doesn't matter how horrible the system, how brutal the system, humans have this capacity. And it can feel very Pollyanna-ish, very, kind of corny to talk about resilience. But I think what gets tricky is that the capacity for resilience too easily becomes the thing that can distract us from confronting and acknowledge. It's that balance. How do we acknowledge the violence of the systems of displacement at the same time that we learned from and validate and acknowledge how humans innovate? And I mean, for me as a slavery scholar, that means seeing those seemingly mundane things like a woman knowing to braid rice in her hair, that then of course gets exploited as the means to create rice as a colonial plantation product. But how do we see those small gestures as resistance? We had a whole debate as slavery scholars about, whether that's something that's not an organized attempt to overthrow the system is resistance. Whenever I teach slavery, I get students who say, I don't understand why they didn't just resist. There were more slaves than there were white plantation owners, in the Caribbean. I mean, so it's understanding how, again, to strike that balance between learning from displaced peoples at the same time that we identify and diagnose and call for the changes that we know we need and want. Yeah.
I think, when I think about sort of the time periods that we're all kind of talking about right now, and teaching a lot about Black history, I think about how critical it's been to work simultaneously within and without, so outside of our communities, but also deeply within our communities. I think about how when COVID pandemic happened, when people were talking about mutual aid networks like it was brand new, and I was like, y'all know that dates back to the 1700s, right? Like free Blacks were doing that then to make sure that they were taken care of inside of white supremacist America, right? Where they had little access to resources and still dealt with racism. And so I think about how they created those kinds of networks that we still rely on heavily today. I think about how when slavery ended, the largely single mothers and elderly women left plantations because they knew they wouldn't be safe and went and sought refuge in small cities and towns in the South. And so being displaced in that way and then building homes in segregated cities in the South, and then ultimately the Great Migration and that sort of level of displacement, which we know, separated families. And systems of care were what held those families together to the degree that they could be. So the experience of, and most of us know this, immigrant families know this, of leaving children with grandparents, of leaving children in one place where parents go work and get settled and whatever, and that's part of so many of our stories. And so trying to find ways to hold on to family and stability and care and love in the face of these systems is so real. And it's interesting to me looking at, it's Stephanie's historian, I'm a sociologist, and one of the reasons I became a sociologist is I was like, I don't know if I can study the past all the time, but I need to understand the past and how it informs today. So everything I teach is deeply chronological. I always start with what has been to understand where we are now. And so I look at, the ingenious ways that Black communities have tried to hold on to whatever they created in terms of Black Wall Streets. They're Black Wall Streets, not just Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And Black parts of town, wherever you go, and the ID and the CD and Harlem and Bronzeville and all these different places while at the same time dealing with the encroachment of now gentrification and being displaced again, right? And so being pushed out to the suburbs of certain communities and having to leave states altogether. And so I'm seeing some of that even now here in Seattle, where some of the grandmoms that I work with in this community are living in the suburbs and their children are leaving Seattle because they can't afford to live here. And so how do you care for your elders at the same time and keep family continuity going? And so I think it's this real sort of balancing between the things that we need to do in the face of knowing that we can't rely on our government to do them for us, while at the same time pushing our government to do what they're supposed to do. And so I love sort of following that, that balance in my work.
So I want to go a little bit of a different direction with this question, in that I want to share a story about a program that we've had, and why we started it, and some of what we've learned from it. So it's going to be really, really concrete. And so as a medical center, like many others, we keep a lot of data. And one of the things that we've been able to do is to look at health outcomes and stratify that by, various things. And so one way that we can look at some of our health outcomes is by the language that is spoken by our patients. So we wondered how our patients who didn't speak English were managing diabetes. And one marker of that is hemoglobin A1C. Now, if there are some of you who are clinicians, let me have this caveat. I am not a clinician. I was trained in sociology, as quite a few folks on this panel are. But here's what I do know about hemoglobin A1C. If it's elevated, especially higher than 7 and especially higher than 9, that really means that the person who has diabetes is not managing their diabetes really well, and that their blood sugar levels are elevated a whole lot of the time. And so every 3 months, patients with diabetes are recommended to have their hemoglobin A1C measured to see how, they're doing. And so, so we looked at that, and I believe it was about 7 or so years ago that we looked at the hemoglobin A1C levels for our patients, and we looked at that by language. And what we saw was that patients who spoke Spanish and patients who spoke Somali had incredibly elevated hemoglobin A1C levels. And so we weren't seeing complications yet for those patients, but what we felt we could predict would be that 10 years down the line for those patients, we probably would be looking at increased levels of amputations and blindness in those very same patients, right? And these are not, these were patients for a hospital, so that receiving the very same care that all other patients were receiving, these very same patients, hemoglobin A1C was elevated, so that they truly were not managing as well. So we decided to try an intervention, which was to add navigators, health navigators, to the healthcare team. And these navigators were bilingual staff, and there were folks from those communities. They were, and they weren't just navigators. They were Rose and Salma, basically, who really studied, and they started out as interpreters, but really worked and were well known in their communities, and really worked to become experts on diabetes, and to really learn about it. And so, to make a long story short, they were extraordinary, and they worked, over 6 months of working with these patients. The patients' hemoglobin A1C levels just, decreased, and they really brought their blood sugar levels under control. So what were some of the things that we learned as a health system that we hadn't realized? One, that that the way that the nutrition classes were being taught was really inadequate. That the food pyramid classes, actually, I went to one of those classes, and I thought, I don't eat that. It's I don't know who does, but truly, I don't eat that. And part of what we heard was that folks in the community said, we thought that we had to stop being kind of fill in that particular community in order to take care of our diabetes. And Rose and Salma organized chaperones with the patients, took the nutritionists out into the community. I mean, some of the things that healthcare should actually look like, as opposed to what it looks like. So this was some of the learning that took place. And this is part of how, again, healthcare needs to change. And this is part of how patients and communities need to impact healthcare for it to actually take place. So in terms of placemaking, navigators and community members have a voice that needs to bring healthcare into a different space. I tell my colleagues that, perhaps, some care is delivered within a medical setting, but actually health takes place within the community setting. And it's a lot of what we all need to learn truly needs to be explored within the community setting. And it's the partnership with the navigators was an absolutely incredible way for us to learn this.
Absolutely. I think as a public health major myself, I really appreciate how you bring up the use of health as a community-based practice outside of just like individual clinical bases. I'd like to do my best to respect our Q&A time, so I'm going to rush us through the very last question. I'm going to ask that everyone do like a quick response. You can still say whatever you want, but yeah, like the big idea that you would like to do for this last one, which I think is my favorite question, because as a college student myself, I think Me and many of my friends are always asking, what do we do with this class? We're taking these classes, we're learning this stuff, but what are we supposed to do about it? So my question to you all is, what is your advice to us as students who want to contribute and be a part of the work to address all these issues that we've talked about tonight?
I think I'll start. I want to point out that I think one of the wonderful things about our conversation tonight is that we've touched on both the kind of macro structural level, and we've also come down to the very concrete. And I think that's a wonderful balance, because I think sometimes we get very lost in not knowing how to understand the relationship between the macro and the concrete. And so I want to first point that out. But in terms of the question, I would say my advice to students is don't be afraid to ask scary questions. And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Okay, I think that the number one lesson that I hope you all will take advantage of, if you speak more than one language, it turns out you could probably speak even more. There's an incredible number of people who come through college and really only functionally speak English, and you're missing a whole world of community that's out there. In my little community garden pea patch, we speak over 10 languages. But when people come to the meetings, they're living their lives in English. And I know for Latinos, it's like, according to the Pew Research Center, 1 in 4 Latinos know someone who's been detained or deported by immigration authorities within the last 12 months. That figure goes up if you speak Spanish as your first language. And so literally, we live in the same city and we're living different realities. And so take advantage of that college education and pick up those language skills so that you can learn to be in conversation with the people who are actually in your community. Second, build those connections. I get the impression when you first show up that you want to try all the things, which is great. But then when you walk out of all these like meetings and gatherings and different stuff, ask yourself, how do I feel? Do I want to go back? Go do fewer things and stick with them longer. That's how you really build connection, and it kind of goes against, I think, the inundation of opportunities that you get your first year. Third thing, if a problem seems really, really hard the way that you're asking it, definitely don't be afraid to ask it. But also, is there a reframe that you can do? I talk about this a lot, so I teach abolition geography, and so often the debates, the problem closure is so deep that you miss the bigger picture, right? It's like, should we have more police or should we have fewer police officers? But instead, the deeper question you want to ask is, what makes me feel safe? What makes me feel safe in my house? What makes me feel safe at the bus stop? What makes me feel safe in my community? And if the goal of abolition isn't just like to throw down all the things we hate, but to build up a community that we love, then maybe we should invest our time in those things.
I've been working on making changes, whether incremental, for individuals or for groups or for communities or structural level changes for over 40 years now. And I can say that, every kind of change is worthwhile, and it's all really, really satisfying. I think, decide where you want your own influence to lie and go for it. All of it is worth it.
Martine, I think I'm building on your suggestion. I think mine is both connected to the last question and this question, which is when I think about sacred placemaking and radical placemaking, I think about the ways in which our communities have historically understood that everybody matters. It doesn't matter what you do, right? We need our folks who are about economic autonomy, and we need our folks who are artists. We need our teachers. We need everybody. So I say, make what you do matter. Like, just figure out how to make it work for you, make sure that it resonates with what your mission, purpose-driven life is, and make it matter. So do good work, whatever you choose to do. I have students often say, well, I'm gonna be a engineer, and make it matter, make it count. You know, share that skill with the community in whatever way you can. So I would say that, and go vote. We need you to vote now more than ever, so yeah, vote.
And I just want to add to that, to not be afraid to be your full self, because there's so much pressure on you all to be just that engineer, as though that engineer is not also all of these other identities. We've talked about how much we wanted in this conversation to bring our full selves, and we've tried to do that. And I hope that that also is a lesson that you all take from the conversation.
Well, absolutely. Thank you all so much for all that insight that you've given us and actionable advice. I'm sure all of us students here really appreciate it. We're going to transition on to our Q&A portion now. So I would like to introduce once again Shannon Hong, who is one of the other students in our honors cohort. She is a neuroscience major with college honors and is our current UW honors communications intern. And she also did a large part in setting up this event and planning it to be what it is right now. So I would like to invite Shannon to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction, Brandon. I'm really excited to be our very first student Q&A coordinator for Global Challenges this year and facilitate a bridge between our audience and our amazing speakers. This is actually our first time curating questions from both an online and in-person audience, so there were some bumps along the road today, but I think we got through it. And I just wanted to say I'm so impressed with the variety of questions that we've received from the audience tonight. And I just think that's a testament to how thought-provoking this conversation has been. And to our wonderful speakers, I have a message from our tech crew, which is to keep your microphones close to your mouth as you're speaking so we can all hear you. So that would be great. So without further ado, I'll pose our very first question from our audience, which is, how do you think the politics of place will evolve in the next few years, especially in the context of displacement due to environmental crisis? And would anyone like to add their thoughts on that?
My sense is that, those questions will only come up much more. I have been watching this fairly intensely. You know, I am from Haiti originally, and I watch hurricane season every single year. And the hurricanes are getting way more intense every year. And I'm grateful every year that hurricanes pass over Haiti without touching down on Haiti, because the devastation that the hurricanes bring about at this time is unparalleled because of climate change. And the refugee crises that I think are caused because of the degradation of the environment in that region of the world is only going to get more intense. And I fear that there is a reluctance to acknowledge climate change because one must acknowledge that that region of the world has not had any responsibility for climate change. As most of the Southern Hemisphere has not caused climate change to the extent that the Northern Hemisphere has. And so I just think it's going to get more and more intense.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think a lot about, a lot of people worry about what are we doing to firm up the borders of the US nation state? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Frankly, I don't spend as much time thinking about that. One, because most of the people who are detained or deported by ICE have actually been living in the US for years already. And two, because I think the numbers of people who are going to be coming north as they face inundation and massive emergencies that due to a series of climate factors is just gonna be so intense that we're not gonna have any choice but to confront it. It's just a question of when. I remember even just a few years ago, my husband, who every once in a while I realize that he's actually listening to the things I tell him. And he was like, wait a minute, I thought that the unaccompanied minor or children migration, he was like, I thought that was a summer thing. Why is it October, November? And all of these kids from Central America are coming to the US. And I was like, oh, I know why. It's because first of all, the maize crop totally failed, so nobody has any food. And then second of all, the coffee rusted, so they don't have anything to sell. So they're sending their kids north because their land is inundated, like literally flooded. And they have no food crop and they have no cash crop. So they're sending their kids north because otherwise they would perish. And he was like, oh. That's gonna keep happening. And when I talk about inundation, I don't mean it as a temporary function. In coastal lowland Guatemala, I mean, people's former farmland, they are losing land. So if there's one group that you don't have to convince that climate change is happening, it's anyone who lives in rural Mexico or Central America. They're deeply aware and have been deeply aware on all sides of the political spectrum of climate change because they haven't been able to ignore it in the ways that I think some of us up here have attempted to and won't be able to. So the politics of place, it's gonna shift because people are shifting, and the trends we're seeing, I think they're only going to increase.
I also think internally about the systemic racism and even the emergency response to what happens within the United States. So there are entire communities that don't get FEMA coverage at all, that are underinsured, if insured at all. It reminds me of Hurricane Katrina, that the most vulnerable were left behind, poor, disabled, children, elders. And so that's a rampant thing right here in the United States too that needs to be addressed. I think one of the things that's clear is like inner cities are hotter, those kinds of things, and that they're just simply not being addressed. That concerns me a great deal, so that when people lose everything, they literally are losing everything.
Yeah, and this is why I think when I say don't be afraid of big scary questions, what I mean is, as we are trying to make sense of these systems that aren't working for the globe, right? It is time to ask ourselves, well, how is capitalism as almost a kind of religion in the powerful modern industrial nation states? How's that working? Maybe treating everything like a commodity, maybe, our notions of privatization, maybe they actually don't work. Because the answers to these problems, they're not simple. They're not about a policy change. They're not about a simple reform. They really are about being willing to unmake and remake our worlds. And that takes understanding really complex and deeply rooted structures and systems that we have been taught we just have to take for granted as, it's progress, it's modernity, it's the way the world works. And it's the way the world isn't working. And yeah.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Since we're short on time, we'll move to our second and final question, which will hopefully end us on a more positive note and actually touches on what Stephanie just said. But this conversation has been about approaching these massive global problems, which is obviously an incredibly daunting task. But how can we as learners and as students approach these questions at a personal level? And are there any life-affirming projects that undergrads here at UW can get involved in to be more of help?
When I learn with students, I always encourage them to bring in their experiences, and especially doing things like interviewing their parents about their experiences of migration, or how do they understand the immigration system based on their student visas. I think, it's one of the important things that being a learner in a university offers is the chance to take questions you've had in your mind that floated around, or an experience that you'd had, or sometimes it's just something that makes you mad, and actually really dig in and say, what's going on here? So I've had students do everything from sort of thinking about the ways in which one student's mother was a factory worker, and they weren't unionized, but they leveraged their power, and they actually did a work stoppage until they were able to get PPE at the beginning of the pandemic. So she went in and she interviewed all these folks and made a zine in Spanish so that she could share that back and talk about the ways in which these big theories that she had around capitalism and worker power helped her to better understand what her mom had been doing that whole time she was in college. So I really, really encourage life learners to start with thinking about where you're at and what your own community is. And for some of us, that's going to be making new communities. And for some of us, that's going to be going back to the people that we know and approaching them with curiosity. I think one of the beautiful things for me that happened was when I moved out of the house with my parents, they got way more interesting. So, if you're one of those people, embrace that, think about it. And curiosity is a form of care. Being curious about the people around you and asking questions about why they ask the questions they do, why they do the work they do, what makes them fulfilled, is a way that you can express care and also get inspiration for yourself. Because oftentimes people are like, I have this drive, but I don't know where to put it. Great. Look at all the people who seem happy, the people you like, the people that are in your world, and take this opportunity to think about what of what's working for them might work for you, and what of that might you want to put aside. And there's tons of projects out here. There's too many. Like I said, try to just focus in on one and give it some real energy and time. And by time, I mean multiple years, not just a quarter.
Yeah, and also just kind of adding a little bit onto that same point. This might be kind of like the peer educator and me talking, but one of the things that came to mind with when you're saying interviewing your parents, I would also highly suggest all of you to interview your teachers and your professors. One of the things I've been doing throughout the last couple of years is some of my classes, you just kind of go into office hours and you literally just have a conversation with that person about whatever the heck you want. You can just ask, what made you go into this area of study? What kinds of projects are you working on? Because I think a lot of the conversations that I went into with just the question of, why are you interested in this? Even though I'm taking your class, why are you interested in it? I think a lot of very interesting conversations have come out of that, and something that I think also applies to all of you as students that are kind of entering into this realm of trying to figure out who you want to talk to and how you want to determine what you're going to be doing in the future. But yeah, that's just something I want to add to that might be helpful if any of you are looking for projects to work on.
I'll second that. I have not ever turned down a student who was interested in working with me. I'm always doing stuff in the community. I had a group of students who worked with me with the Mayor's Council for African American Elders. We put together a report for the mayor, and they delivered the report. I have a co-authored piece with 5 incredible young women who have now all graduated about Black motherhood during the Jim Crow era, coming out in a edited volume on Black motherhood during the BLM movement. So I just feel like there are just so many opportunities to work with your professors. I think taking that step and reaching out, and the undergrad research opportunity program is a really great one. That's how I met the young women that I worked with on this particular book chapter. So I think, yeah, just really connecting with not just your peers, but also you have an incredible resource of professors and staff on this campus.
And I would encourage you to explore what's out there in the community. I have been a member of the African American Health Board Coalition, and there's the Community Health Board Coalition that has, I believe it's 18 different ethnic and cultural health boards. And it's a wonderful, wonderful forum. And it's lively. This group did incredible work, especially during COVID, bringing screening and vaccination to different community groups. And so, you know, I really do encourage you to stay in touch. And, you know, I just have to say, just in closing, it may sound really depressing, or this conversation might have been really depressing. I am not without hope. Quite the opposite. I have a daughter who's 26 years old, and I love to tell her that I am so impressed by her generation and by y'all's generation. I'm really touched because the way she challenges me, the way she questions me, and in a respectful way, but she never takes my word, you know, as the answer, to the core. And I always tell her that, you know, hers is the generation that, at least I feel that, you know, I hoped for, but wasn't sure that we deserved, but still came. And I am just so grateful. I'm so grateful for you all. Yeah. I really am. Me too.
And I would just, as the last on this final question, say to take seriously what it means to make getting out of the classroom a really central part of your education. I think that just connects to what Martine said, and it also connects to what Megan said earlier about connecting. I think that the reason understanding displaced communities and displaced persons' resilience is so important is precisely because these problems are big, deep structural problems that aren't going to change tomorrow, that don't have a simple solution. And so in the meantime, while we are unmaking and rebuilding a world for all of ourselves, we need that resilience, because that's how we know that we do know how to take care of ourselves, that we do know how to thrive, that those stories about rice sewn into someone's hair, or the concrete example that Martine provided about those healthcare navigators, tell us that our communities actually do have our own answers, right? And it's actually incredibly life-affirming to connect with other people working on a problem. So get out of your classroom, get into an organization, get in the community, and connect with people around solving these problems, because that's not a lonely or depressing place to be.
I was taking a lot of notes to those questions because those are some really powerful responses. So thank you for sharing. And those were the questions that we had time for tonight. I just wanted to say thank you to our audience for submitting such thoughtful questions, and for our amazing speakers for sharing your diverse perspectives. I've definitely learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope everyone feels the same way as well. And Brandon, I'll hand it back to you now.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for handing that over. We're just going to take a little bit of time now. I want to first just go back around each person and just say, as we kind of start to close out this event, 1 or 2 words that just describe how you're feeling right now. we've talked about a lot of very heavy topics and very serious ones, and I just want to know what you all think about where we head in the future.
Grateful and optimistic. Grateful and optimistic.
Don't know where we're going, but I think we'll go together.
Connection is what comes to mind.
Reflective and hopeful.
I've got to say, those are some of the most powerful words that I have heard throughout this entire quarter in college. It is so great to see all the positive feeling and forward thinking and actionable stuff that we're able to talk about tonight. As we close out, LaShonda, would you like to lead us in a meditation?
I will. So it'll be really quick. I think it's a really wonderful way to sort of all come into the space together, especially as we leave and go our separate ways. It's a way to sort of capture all of this collective goodness. So I'll invite you to just sort of get comfortable wherever you're seated. And if you feel comfortable, you can softly look downward or close your eyes, whatever works best for you in the space, in your body. Just bringing your awareness to the moment. To the present. And as you connect with whatever anchors you most in this moment, be it your breath, your body, your thoughts, I invite you to just drill down and sort of see what's there for you. What's present? What are you taking away from this really timely, depthful conversation? What about this moment do you most want to hold on to? Just a couple more breaths. And I'll invite you to sort of softly open your eyes or turn your gaze upward and share whatever came up with you with the person next to you. Don't be afraid, they won't bite. Person next to you, in front of you, beside you, what's there?
But it was so much fun. It was fun. We all are agreeing that we're glad it's over. But it was a lot of fun. It was fun and
Brandon, do you want to ask them what's there? What came up? You want to have them shout out some of what came up?
We'll give them like another 30 seconds to.
I'm a sucker for
Oh, I know. I'm being just, yeah, I'm right there.
and you work with elders. That is
Me
great.
too. Me too.
Okay, so
Me too. We gotta go back. We gotta hang out. We totally gotta hang out.
All right, thank you everyone for participating in the activity. We're gonna just wrap up your last conversation and we'll come back in just a moment.
We're happy to know that some things came up. It sounds like some things came up. It's a good thing.
Yes, let's just hear, everyone just like shout out like a couple things that you were thinking about. Be brave.
What are you gonna take with you?
It is very cold outside, and now it's wet and rainy.
Family. Inspiration, interconnection. What else?
Resolve.
Resolve.
Interdisciplinary.
Yeah. Yes.
Resilience.
Resilience. It's always a good one. Make it matter. This is what we need more of all the time.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Yes. I love hearing all the things that come about, and also just the emphasis on connection. I have to say is one that I think is absolutely incredible. I heard a lot of words that are kind of around that same concept, and I think that is something very important that all of us should hold on to. With that, I think we're going to have to start closing out this conversation. It has been an incredible night. I cannot say enough how grateful I am to be able to have heard a conversation from such incredible speakers. But yeah, we're going to start closing out. So for everyone here and everyone in the live stream, this conversation is going to be recorded and posted online tomorrow morning. So should you want to rewatch, if you want to reprocess anything that we said, or if you want to share it with your friends and family, it'll be right there for you. Thank you again to all of our speakers for just being here. We know you have a very busy schedule, but we are all just so grateful for the time and energy that you have put to be here today, and for all the work that you do for both the university community and the broader community as a whole. And to the audience, thank you everyone for being here and being engaged in this conversation. We hope that no matter what discipline, profession you're in, that you could take away something from this conversation that is useful to you, or that is actionable, or that you simply just found interesting. And specifically to our honors students, there's a lot of Honors 100 students in the room right now. I'd like to invite all of you to just think about being uncomfortable, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and continuing to ask these hard questions and question ourselves, our institutions, the communities that we're in, and even society as a whole. And at the same time, making sure that we can keep these values of kindness and hope with us at all times, that I think were also resonated in a lot of the responses that you all just gave. Yeah, once again, thank you everyone for just being here. I'm truly inspired by all the participation, and for all of you that have shown up to this conversation. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming to Global Challenges 2022.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you,
Brandon.